Hey guys, Brian from Boas here. I've been getting a lot of questions from you guys asking about feeding baby boas and specifically how to move them from eating live to eating frozen thawed rodents. So today I want to go over some tips for how you can manage this transition. I'm also going to give you guys details on how I establish my babies and get them feeding and then move them over to frozen thawed prey items with some miscellaneous tips and tricks regarding feeding babies and even adult boas. So make sure you stay tuned for that. So this is actually one of my 2021 baby Suriname Boas. This guy's doing really well. He was born just a few weeks ago. And so he's already eaten 2 meals. And so when I start my baby boas off, I typically will start them on live mouse fuzzies or live mouse hoppers, suitably sized mouse. I know a lot of people have commented that they use rat pinkies or rat fuzzies, and I know there's some controversy around starting babies on rats versus mice, and I've seen people in favor of either rats or mice for supposed nutrition benefits. And so I've done a little bit of research on this. I can't find any convincing evidence that it's the species of rodent per se, but rather it's how the rodent was raised. So you want to start them off on rodents that were fed a really high quality diet and that are going to be, nutritionally sound for your baby boas. But as far as rat versus mouse, either one can be used. I've heard some arguments about, maybe that one type is more likely to lead to regurgitation in true red tails, and also maybe that, a smaller rodent like a pinky has a higher fat content and they've got milk in their bellies, so it's more likely to be regurgitated. Therefore a equally sized mouse would be more developed than an equally sized rat. The mouse would have more connective tissue and maybe be a little less likely to be regurgitated than an equally sized rat, but I haven't seen any concrete evidence in favor of this. Personally, I start them on mice just because I have a small breeding colony of mice. I don't have a breeding colony of rats, and that's easy and convenient for me. So I'll give them a few meals of live mice. So this guy has already eaten 2. For his next meal, I'm going to switch him over to frozen thawed. And with true red-tail boas, it's usually a cinch to get them to eat frozen thawed. I've never had any difficulty at all, and usually they take them, from the beginning. I've even heard about, true red tails that will start off on frozen thawed. However, a lot of other types of locality boas, specifically the island boas and the dwarf boas, are a little bit harder. With my Tarahumaras and Hog Islands, typically I'll have to keep them on live, sometimes till they're like 6 months old. And they're a lot more picky when it comes to switching from live to frozen thawed. And I'll have to do, a number of different tricks. So I just wanted to give you guys an insight on some of the tricks that I use. But before that, I wanted to comment on how I handle a baby boa that won't even eat live. And I found that most of my baby boas will, after usually 1 or 2 feedings, especially like the red tails. I do sometimes have some island boas. Ooh, he's a little hissy today. Island boas that they just don't want to eat for whatever reason. So typically I'll offer them at least maybe 4 or 5 chances to eat alive. And then if they reach about 2 months, 2.5 months without eating, I start to get a little worried. So that's where I resort to assist feeding. And I try to be as gentle and non-invasive as possible. This guy is showing his nature as a Pearl Island Boa. But you basically use what I call assist feeding rather than force feeding. Some people will actually take a whole pinky or fuzzy and, kind of shove it down the throat. What I found works well is just using a mouse tail. I just take a tail from an adult mouse, cut it off the mouse, and then I lubricate it by soaking it in water or egg white. And then it's really easy just to gently open the snake's mouth, and this guy is opening it a lot for me today. But I open the mouth and I just gently insert the tail in and just gently push it down. And it's really non-invasive. It does very minimal or if any damage. You want to, you don't want to stress out the snakes. That's why I hate doing any kind of force or assist feeding. But sometimes you don't really have a choice, and the snake is going to starve if you don't do this. And I found that after doing this, usually a few times, the snakes will typically start eating. So it seems to work, it seems to do the trick. It does, you know, very minimal damage. So I would recommend assist feeding a mouse tail. And I'm going to stick this guy back before his mouth hits the target. Okay, so say you have a boa that's feeding on live, but now you want to switch it to freeze thawed, and it doesn't seem to be working. A few tips that you might want to try, and hopefully you'll have better luck. So what I would suggest is, rather than going from a live to a frozen thawed, you want to start with a fresh killed rodent. So you want to obtain a live rodent, sacrifice it by cervical dislocation, and then you want to use that to feed your snake. The fresh killed rodent is going to have the smell of a live rodent and thus be more likely to be eaten by your picky snake. So you'll want to do this a few times, and then you can switch your snake over to a frozen thawed rodent. And so when you do use a frozen thawed rodent, what you're going to want to do is get really fresh rodents. In fact, if you can just freeze some down that were, you know, you just euthanize them and you froze them down just for a day or two, that's the best, because they'll most likely to retain that rodent smell. When you take a rodent and you stick it in the freezer, it starts to lose its smell and it starts to absorb smells from the environment, especially if you have it right next to your cookies and cream ice cream, and that's going to turn your snake off. So you want to have nice fresh rodents that have the smell. And incidentally, after about 6 months or so, you probably don't want to feed these to your snake anymore, because they're going to lose their freshness and their nutritional value. And so when you are thawing your frozen rodents, you want to make sure that you bring it up to body temperature of a mammal, which is about, 98 degrees or so. And so what you don't want to do, you never want to put it in the microwave, because of course it's going to heat up, a small part of it to just under the temperature of the surface of the sun, and the rest is going to be frozen. And they also have a tendency to explode, leaving the mouse guts on the side of your microwave. So what you want to do that works best is to gradually thaw it. Typically I leave my rodents out overnight, just let them thaw at room temperature. And then you're going to want to warm them up on a heat pad, to around 90 degrees or so. And typically I just take a flex wad or an ultratherm heater, just plug it in, heat up the rodents for a couple hours, and they're nice and ready to go. Some people will soak them in hot water. I don't like this because it gets all wet and bedding sticks to the rodent. And I found just, room temperature and then the heat pad works really well. And so it gets the rodent to the body temperature, and your snake will sense it as being a live rodent. The next trick, of course, is to manipulate your rodent so that the snake thinks that it's alive. So you're going to want to take your tweezers or feeding tongs or your grabber, whatever you use to offer the rodent to the snake, and you're going to want to hold it right up in front of the snout of the snake and kind of wiggle it around. I've seen people that will actually take a rodent by the tail and kind of dangle it right in front of the mouth of the snake, which is really not a good idea, because there's a chance that the snake could miss and get your hand. In fact, I've even seen people doing that with rabbits in front of a reticulated python, which is really, asking for trouble. So use whatever tool that you use for feeding, dangle the rodent, kind of move it around. You can even kind of tease the snake, kind of flick it in its face. You don't want to hurt your snake, but you can kind of do this with the rodent. And sometimes that'll piss the snake off enough so that it grabs the rodent. And so what you'll see typically will happen is many snakes will grab the rodent and then they'll constrict, and that's good. And you want the snake to think that the rodent is alive. Unfortunately, sometimes they just spit out the rodent. They see that it's not alive and that they don't interpret that as food, and they stop and spit it out. So then you have to go back. You have to pick up the rodent with your tongs and do the same thing. And you might have to repeat the process 2 or 3 times. I've had some snakes like Hog Island Boas, other island boas, they're just a little picky, and you just have to keep going back, which can be a little bit annoying. I found what helps is that when they strike the rodent and constrict, I gently grab the tail and kind of tug on it a bit, just to give the snake that it's the impression that it's alive, and that seems to work. But I'll go back and I'll check after about half an hour, make sure that the snake ate the rodent, and if it didn't, I'll have to go and go through the whole process again. Sometimes your boa won't eat a frozen thawed rodent just because it's a little bit stressed out. So you want to make the enclosure as low stress as possible for your boa. Of course, you want to have a lot of hiding places. You want to keep the noise down to a minimum and not have people constantly walking past the enclosure. And what I would recommend, if you have a boa that doesn't seem to be striking when you dangle the frozen thawed rodent in front of it, I would just take the rodent, put it into the hiding place, and then put the boa in the hiding place with the rodent, and then just leave them alone for a few hours. In fact, you probably want to dim the lights in the snake room and just let the snake chill out with the rodent. And most of the time, just by leaving them alone, the snake will eat the frozen thawed rodent. You know, some snakes just have some kind of a stage fright when it comes to eating frozen thawed prey. You can even leave the rodent overnight. Another thing to consider, if your snake doesn't recognize the scent of a frozen thawed rodent, you can use a live rodent and just rub it on the dead rodent to get the scent transferred. Or alternatively, you can take the frozen thawed rodent and put it in some mouse bedding that's been soiled, and that will transfer the scent. But anything to make your frozen thawed rodent smell a little fresher seems to help. The last thing to consider with the snake that won't eat frozen thawed is, what is your feeding regimen? Are you feeding the snake too much so it's not hungry? And if your snake doesn't eat frozen thawed, what I would recommend is you just skip a few feedings. Okay, so let's say you're feeding your snake every 10 to 14 days, which is appropriate for a snake up to about 2 to 3 years of age. If it doesn't eat at one feeding, just wait another week and a half or 2 weeks. Offer the frozen thawed for a second time. And then if that doesn't work, wait another week and a half to 2 weeks. Offer the frozen thawed. Sometimes you just have to make them a little bit more hungry and they'll take the frozen thawed. And believe me, you're not going to do any damage to your snake by missing a few feedings. In fact, the vast majority of boas in captivity are on the overweight side. And so these tricks I told you about, they'll work for both for babies to switch over to frozen thawed. They'll also typically work for adult boas that only will eat live prey. Once in a while, you'll run into an adult boa that's just been so habituated on live prey, it's very difficult to get it to switch. And I've had a few boas that I've had some challenges with. This is actually one of them. This is a 3-year-old holdback Tarahumara dwarf boa. And this one just likes live. You know, when I try to feed it the frozen thawed, even with the tricks I use, typically she'll spit out the frozen thawed. I'll have to go back. I'll have to do it again. And then often I'll have to go back for a third time. You know, so once in a while I'll cave. I'll still give her a live one, just if I have like an extra breeder I'm getting rid of. But there are just a few snakes like this. And I have actually a Honduran firebelly female who's a year older than this one, and she's the same way. She just wants live, and it can be annoying and inconvenient. Sometimes I just cave. I found with this Honduran firebelly, for some reason she'll take frozen thawed chicks, but as far as rodents, she wants live. So I'll feed her a lot of chicks, and while I'm here, I'll say that it's good not just to feed rodents, but also to feed different types of birds like chicks and quail of various sizes, just to give your boas some variety and hopefully give them a little bit better nutrition. That was some thoughts on getting your boa to switch from live to frozen thawed prey items. I hope this was helpful, and best of luck with switching your picky feeders. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas.